Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, ADEOLA ADEJOBI.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. The MBBA is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist with the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
Today, we're going to discuss the ramifications of the recently passed New York City Charter revisions, and specifically ranked choice voting. Now, joining us today is attorney John Owens and district leader of the 70th Assembly District, Cordell Cleare. Welcome, and let's get to it. So thank you, Cordell and John, for joining us today. So as we know, there have been some recent changes that were passed at the most recent election regarding the New York City Charter. So before we get started into the weeds of it, John, can you tell us a little bit about what exactly the New York City Charter is?
Thank you for having us. The New York City Charter is, in essence, the city's constitution. So it directs the powers of the various city agencies, the mayor, corporation council, public advocate, and those different roles that we vote on in most municipal elections. So it gives us the guidance and directions for their authority, their powers, and the function of how our city was created.
And what we were just seeing is that there are five different revisions that were being put to voters. So can you tell us a little bit about what those were?
So broadly, to most people's displeasure, the 7.5 font on the ballot, but ultimately there were 19 proposals that were up for consideration to modify the city charter, and they typically group them into 5 categories. So I'll just list the 5 categories and then we can discuss each of them in greater detail, but they lump one group into what they referred as elections. There were reforms to the Civilian Complaint Review Board. There were also a group of proposals that were lumped as ethics and governance. There were a group that were lumped as city budget. And the final group were things that were meant to impact land use in New York City.
So first, why don't we get into a conversation about some of the revisions that were just being reviewed. So one of that mention had to do with elections. So Cordell, could you tell us a little bit about the revision that was just passed?
So, this is a historic change. For the first time, the next election that you'll be voting, city elections, you will be choosing 5 candidates as opposed to 1. And it will be a ranked choice voting system where you choose your number 1 through number 5. You will be able to choose up to 5, and you will rank them in the order of preference.
Right, and you'll be choosing 5 for what particular position?
All the city elected positions, from city council to borough president, public advocate, controller, mayor. So
we're talking about something that's just very different than what we've seen in the past. And I think there have been a couple of maybe other cities that have, or states that have looked at this as well.
So we've had it in other locations, and other locales have tried it out. So the Charter Revision Commission, which was actually implemented by the City Council through legislation, reviewed in their material other jurisdictions. I think California was sort of some of the jurisdictions that they might primarily use, and I believe Maine has sort of examples of where people have had ranked choice voting, and some people also refer to it as instant runoff. So there have been 2 terms in which people have described it. So those are some of the other jurisdictions that have used ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting.
Yeah, and what was some of the rationale behind taking a change like this?
Primarily, most people who are in favor of it, their primary motive for having it was, one, to save money in runoffs. So currently for citywide offices, so for mayor and public advocate and controller, if you don't in the primary receive 40% of the vote, there then is a subsequent runoff. It used to historically be 2 weeks later, but now they did extend the time primarily because of the new machines and additional time needed to reprogram them. So the argument for this was that we would spend sometimes if you use the public advocate race with now current AG Letitia James, when she had her first runoff election, the argument was that the runoff cost more than what her annual budget for the office would be. So there was a question as to whether that was an efficient use of money.
So now with the rank system, how does it work? It's top two, it's whoever, if you get 50% or more, there is no runoff. How does that work?
So yes, so ultimately what people want is the narrative, is an ability to sort of say that you've gotten what looks like more representative public support for any office that you win. So we can use the most recent special election for public advocate as an example. So I believe, at least in terms of what the Campaign Finance Board recognized, there were 17 candidates who ran for that particular office in the special election. So the concern is that while someone may win, they only won with 17% of those who turned out. Yes, they won, but is it representative of the city in its entirety when you have that many people running for a particular office? So if we use that as the model, ranked choice voting, at least as it's been explained, would have ultimately said each person would have had an ability to rank their top 5 choices. The initial tally would be done. If no one had 50% plus 1 initially out of the gate, what they would then do is take the lowest vote getter. So that would have been whoever was 17th. I'm going to exclude that there were a significant number of write-ins, but we just go with the 17. The person who received the lowest votes, what they would then do is eliminate that person and now go to whomever was their second place choices on their ballot.
So in that example, everyone who voted for person number 17, they're going to take all of those individuals and then essentially allocate those votes to the other 16. That's essentially what we're saying, correct?
Based upon their next choice. So,
Right,
so they would redistribute those ballot. That ballot would now go to whomever was their second choice. So once that's done, they would then see if someone had reached the threshold of 50 plus 1.
Right. So
If not, you keep eliminating using the lowest vote getter. Now 17 is probably a larger number,
right,
but that was sort of an example of why people thought that this was a better system. One, it would save money, but you'll also get a sense of having what people would feel is a majority, sort of speaking about who should be their representative, and not simply having so many people run that you may only win with one small constituency.
This is obviously a very complicated system that we're going to be implementing very soon. As a community leader, what have you heard from folks about this this new change? Are people for it? Are people against it? Or what are your thoughts?
People are confused by it. They don't understand it. And even as he wonderfully explained just now, I'm sure there's still confusion around how it pans out. None of us know how this really is going to impact our communities until it actually plays out. I'm always saying the devil is in the details, and we don't know how it's going to pan out. And what we're hoping that it doesn't take communities that were traditionally represented by people of color, by black people in particular, and take the opportunity away from them. Because now what's going to happen, especially in areas that are rapidly gentrifying, you now have where you can't win with just 30% of the vote. You can't win with just that. You have to actually go out and get other votes, and conceivably it could flip things around against the community. So we have to be very careful that we're not taking away elected positions from black people and people of color in this city. We don't feel like we have enough representation as it is. So we just want to make sure that we're not further marginalizing communities of color. But it's a very confusing process, and we're going to have to do a lot of education in our community in terms of even just telling people to go out and vote for 5 people. That's a lot.
Right, and because this sounds really confusing. What if someone decides that they're just going to pick one person? I mean, usually there's one candidate that you're usually supporting for the most part, and then I think just to break it up a little bit more is usually when you see a ballot, there is a candidate based off of each party. So now Democrats have 5, Republicans have 5. Like, how exactly does that work?
So this would primarily be in primaries and special, not primary. It will be in primaries and special elections. So ultimately, if it is a primary election, everyone that you would be voting for would all be members of that particular party.
Okay.
So here, it wouldn't be a question of, am I voting for mixed party? It would all be Democrats if you are doing it in the Democratic primary, if you're doing it in the Republican primary. Typically under New York City law, if there is a special election, those who run under non-party monikers. So you wouldn't have that same scenario anyway. So again, using the special election for public advocate, while you knew the party enrollment of most of the people running, they did not run under their particular party. Ultimately, in past charter revisions, that was deemed as a way to ensure that it opened up the system and not simply have what some people argue about the state way of doing it, where you simply have someone appoint a particular candidate to run if there's a vacancy. So in special elections, you don't initially get to run under your party line. So Jumaane Williams, who is a Democrat, did not run under the Democratic line for the special election.
Right, and so to my previous question, what if someone only puts a 1 by one person and potentially puts 5 or 6 by everyone else? Like, what does that mean? How is that going to be? Because I, like I said before, I don't think most people are like, oh, I like this person first and I like this person second.
So, as everyone sort of mentioned, there are also the nuances of how it is formally constructed, but my understanding, or at least in terms of some of the panel discussions that I've participated in, at least in what I've heard in terms of that response, ultimately what happens is so if I go in and say, I have loyalty, I'm only voting for one person, if that person was not initially the first top vote getter, and so imagine in my scenario, we'll reduce it from 17, I only vote for one person, that person comes in as the lowest vote total getter, my vote then would be over because it wouldn't have an ability to be reapportioned to anyone else if my person didn't make the cutoff of the highest vote getters, because I've not given myself an option to have my ballot reallocated to someone else. So, I am free to vote my conscience.
That's exactly what you wanted it to do. Yes. Either it was your candidate or nothing.
So the question I have, and I recognize, I think everyone is trying to wrap their heads around this and what this will mean. So I don't think anyone has any, data that anyone feels pretty confident in just yet. But to me, it seems like there may also be a certain level of, randomness that comes into this in some ways. So, for example, let's say instead of 17, let's say we had 5 people who are running, right? And and even within a particular party, you may have some folks who are more progressive and people who are more conservative. Let's say the progressive candidate was the top vote getter, but didn't get to 50%, right? But the 5th candidate, the one who came in 5th, is a much more conservative candidate. And maybe those conservative points or votes are just enough to be able to get that 2nd candidate up, even though maybe the 3rd and 4th candidates were also progressive. So it's just interesting to me, like how this is going to change things, and how people, I think, when they're running for their elections, how they're going to change their approaches.
Yeah, it is pretty random, and I know we talked earlier about this being done in other places, but I think by far New York City is probably the largest city that this is happening in. So it is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out.
And then actually to do this, we had to change the New York City charter. That's correct, right? Yes. So let's say hopefully it works out perfectly and everyone's happy, but let's say it doesn't. I mean, I guess we kind of skipped a step in, the way you change the charter, what have you. Let's say people don't like this change. I mean, what type of recourse is available to the city?
So ultimately, what you would have to do is either commissions to change the charter. So there are certain things about the charter that the legislator can change themselves. And then there are certain things where they say this is important enough that you have to then put it to the voters. You can't just unilaterally do it yourself. So certain things, so this would be one that was put to us already. So to undo it, they would have to come back to people. So you can either create a charter review commission through the city council can do it, or the mayor. You can have New York State legislation create a charter commission to look at it. Voters can say, we want to initiate a petition to sort of get the issue on the ballot because we're outraged by this and we want to change it back to a system that we like. And so those are sort of the primary methods by which one can sort of go about saying, we've tried this, we've looked at it, and it did not sort of pan out the way that we wanted it to. So here, ranked choice voting would actually be implemented beginning January 1st of 2021.
And so some of the positive feedback around this ranked choice voting is that this actually provides opportunities for people that are in other parties, libertarians, et cetera, Green Party, to have a fair shot at this process. I would love to get your thoughts on that.
I think one of the good things about this, though, what I am excited about if it plays out this way, it will make candidates go to more than just their base, I hope. They will reach out to other parts of the community, other people in the community, and include everybody, and you can't just win with just a small number of people. So I think that's a positive if it plays out like that and causes people to go out and talk to everybody and try to get votes everywhere. As far as I don't know what it does for, I'm a Democrat, so I don't know what it does for others, but I do think that, and it also, what I do think it should do, is make people look at the issues. And if we are going to do ranked choice voting, you really need to look at what people represent for communities and not just personalities and not just people you're familiar with, but look at what they represent and what they want to do for the community.
So another positive, I guess, what most people have argued is it sort of gives you more of an option in terms of choices. So to Jason's point earlier, even within the Democratic Party, you may begin to say, well, I may personally like that person, but I want to go with someone who I think may have a better chance at winning. So sometimes people say, well, I'm not necessarily voting my heart, I'm voting my head. And so one of the arguments is it at least gives you the ability to say, well, I want to denote my first choice by saying you're my first choice, but I may be in an area that may not fully support you, but I at least get to say by my ballot, I said you were my choice, but I also have additional options to sort of, again, show that the person who did win, to Cordell's point, spoke to the larger community at large and didn't simply say, well, if I hold on to this core 25% and 17 people are running, that should be enough, and I don't have to go to other neighborhoods to sort of engage them about policy decisions because I can just keep my one segment of a county, and that's enough for me to win.
And actually it makes a lot of sense. So I imagine another one of those positives, and this kind of harps back to I think what Cordell was going to, is that you may think that you have enough votes or, this may be your base, but maybe there are folks who you have never really engaged with that you're going to feel maybe I should engage with. And on the other side, from a voter standpoint, maybe folks will think that, okay, this is my candidate and that's who I want to go with. But in case that doesn't happen, let me hear about some other folks as well and what their viewpoints are so that I know who I want to put as second or third. And maybe it'll change the way we look at the concept of civic engagement. So I know that there are a number of other issues that were also on the ballot. So I'll leave it to you guys which ones to go to next. But I know two that certainly come to mind has to do with the revisions when it comes to the Civilian Complaint Review Board, as well as some that have to do with land use.
So the CCRB, their primary adjustments were to add 2 members to the CCRB board.
Well, before you do that, what is a CCRB?
The CCRB is the Civilian Complaint Review Board.
And what do they do?
So their primary role and objective is to monitor certain complaints against police officers with respect to a whole subsect of things. So they don't necessarily do some of the department things, but if their engagement with the public overall is challenged, citizens can go to the Civilian Complaint Review Board and lodge complaints, and they have certain powers and authority to investigate those particular occurrences.
Okay.
There are so many other agencies that have some sort of control over them overall, but that's sort of the bullet point narrative of what they did. So one argument was to give greater oversight. They added a board seat where the public advocate can appoint someone, and the city council and the mayor would also jointly appoint the person who would then become the chair. So the argument was it gave more elected officials an impact and a say in the governance of the CCRB.
Okay.
And actually, and since you started with that one, what would we think is going to be the impact of that, having the public advocate and as well as, I guess, the mayor also have an additional seat when it comes to the CCRB?
It's not abundantly clear. I mean, just what they felt is it gave more voices in terms of not simply having the executive, which is the code name for the mayor, as being the only person who fully appointed all of the board chairs. So to the extent that the public advocate in the city charter is deemed as someone who also serves as a watch on the power of the mayor, by giving these different bodies an ability to also appoint, just sort of balances out the control of the mayor. But fundamentally,
it also requires a little more reporting from the NYPD when certain recommendations are made and things happen. They need to report back to the people exactly how are you handling this case, what's going on, this person suspended, this person's still working. There's going to be more reporting from that perspective, because sometimes I know I'm puzzled by some of these cases that go forward where civilians are killed innocently or brutality occurs, and we kind of don't know what the NYPD is doing as it relates to the officers involved. So I think this reporting.
Yeah, so to that point, one of the other provisions were that if the CCRB made a recommendation for a certain punishment for a matter that they did in their internal process prosecute, they would typically make recommendations to the police commissioner and would have no knowledge of how the police commissioner then decided to implement punishment. So if they recommend a discipline and the commissioner chooses to do something different, the commissioner is now required to report to the CCRB why they differed with their recommendation. So that was one of the other prongs. It also gives the CCRB the ability to now open investigations if they deem that an officer has made a false official statement during their overall investigation. So there are narratives where they feel that police officers are not fully honest in their investigation. So now gives them greater strength in that if they feel they have evidence of that, they can open their own investigation into that particular thing. And the final thing in terms of at least what it provides for is a floor with respect to the CCRB's budget. So the argument being that to fully effectively manage the police department in this oversight role, we need to make sure that we have a minimum funding that is used as a metric of their staff, of the police department staff, so that they will have the personnel to effectively do the investigations. Because you can give people power, but if they don't have the staff to follow through, it's not worth anything.
Right, and then with the few minutes that we have left, can you talk about some of the changes to the land use?
Primarily, the two major changes were to formalize a pre-certification process. So ultimately, one of the primarily complaints was notice for communities in terms of things that impacted land use. And the second one was to expand some of the time that community boards had to report on things. So primarily, the biggest argument was sort of what would be deemed as summer months. So if you had July through July 15th, July 1st to July 15th, the standard time would be 60 days, but it's expanded to 75. And if a proposal came to the community board in June, it gave them 90 days to sort of review it versus most boards don't meet in August, so you easily lose 30 days. And some don't meet in July just because people are traveling and it's hard to get quorum. So that's the big picture, but I guess Cordell can sort of speak more to how.
Yeah. So I think more time is good. I see that as a good thing, especially those months while they're on hiatus. Boards do, these are non-paid appointed positions where people do a whole lot of work. But I think what would have been helpful, no matter how much time they have, I think boards need much more support. When you're talking about land use items, we're going through something in particular right now in Harlem with the Lenox Terrace. You really need to be able to sit down and understand the full gravity of what the application is asking for. And, we need planners and we need people who understand the racial impact, the environmental impact, the impact on infrastructure, on transportation, on schools, on health facilities. When you're talking about bringing in a large number of residents to a small footprint, you're talking about another 1,600 units, 1,200 to 1,600 units. And you're asking people who are volunteering for a position to look at this proposal, an application from a developer that could potentially build something that big, and then that there's an impact. You don't know what it is on small business and business in general in the area. I think that, yes, more time, but I think we also should look at giving more backup, more staff, or resources to our board so that they can make better decisions for the community.
Yes, and that is a great final point because we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you for joining us today and talking about this very important subject matter. Thank you so much for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
Goodbye.